In prior videos, we've looked at wrestlers who have managed to cross over to different eras and still remain a part of the industry. But while it's one thing to go between two adjoining time periods like the Attitude Era and Ruthless Aggression Era, or even to last a decade or more between periods like the Golden Era and the PG Era, it's another thing to go all the way from the mid-90s during the New Generation Era and still be wrestling today to tell the tale. But that's exactly what the people we're about to look at today have done, starting with Billy Gunn. Yes, any New Generation Era fan will remember the introduction of Billy Gunn as one half of the rootin' tootin' cowboy duo the Smoking Guns back in 1993. Needless to say then, Billy and his kayfabe brother Bart would find fast success, with them ending up spending 3 years together and becoming tag team champions on 3 separate occasions. That said, as time went on, it became clear a change was going to be needed for the Florida native if he wanted to stay relevant. And this was why, in 1997, right as the New Generation Era was drawing to a close, he'd turn heel and hitch his wagon to Road Dogg as he became a New Age outlaw instead. And this would prove to be a great career move for the tag team specialist, as it would keep him in a job all the way up to the present day. Of course, he's not working for WWE anymore today, though. No, in 2025, Gunn is a member of the All Elite Wrestling roster, with him there serving the dual role of backstage coach and occasional in-ring performer, most memorably as Daddy Ass, 1/3 of the Acclaimed. What a turn-up for the books that is then, because if you could go back to 1993 today and imagine that Monty Sopp would still be a character on national television over 3 decades later, many would have called you mad. But he is, and he's still going strong, with his current gimmick allowing him to stay beloved by fans even when he's only managing Anthony Bowens from ringside. Where will the future take Billy Gunn? Will he continue on to whatever era comes next for wrestling? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. He's certainly still in good enough physical health to go for a while yet, and he is not the only member of the current-day AEW roster who's aged like a fine wine after first rising to prominence during the New Generation Era. No, the same thing could be said about our next subject too, Dustin Rhodes. Back during 1995, though, he wasn't going by that name. No, after having a great early run as a star of the future in World Championship Wrestling between 1991 and 1995, it would be in the middle of the decade that the grandson of a plumber would sign on the dotted line with WWF. And when he did this, Vince McMahon would create an all-new character for him, an androgynous figure who went by the name of Goldust. And Dustin was able to make this new character work by committing to it to the point it got over. So much would he get it over, in fact, there are plenty of people who now retroactively cite Goldust as representing the first spark of the Attitude Era, which would come a few years later, an era Dustin would also be there for. But even after this era came to an end, it wasn't like he had any intention of hanging up his boots. No, while addiction issues led to some very unstable years for the Dallas native, come the end of the mid-2010s, he'd have gotten himself cleaned up and gotten his life back on track. And that would eventually see him join his brother Cody when he helped to form AEW in 2019, with Dustin remaining in the Jacksonville-based company to this day, not just as a backstage agent, but also as someone who still occasionally hits the ring too. And that's quite an achievement when you consider all the punishment that Dusty Rhodes' son has put his body through over the years. But then the punishment he's put his body through might still pale in comparison to our next subjects and their bump cards, the team who have now been doing this across 4 full decades, the Hardy Boys. Yes, in the rankings of all-time great tag teams, they're easily in the top 5, maybe even the greatest of all. And while they did first rise to prominence during the Attitude Era, most notably during those iconic TLC matches with the Dudley Boys and Edge and Christian, they actually got their start in WWF a few years before this. That's right, in truth, Matt and Jeff first arrived on the roster in the mid-90s during the New Generation Era. Though you'd be forgiven for forgetting this, as they weren't exactly a focused-upon act at the time. Rather, back then they were very much jobbers, a pair who could be brought in whenever another, more established act needed a quick win in order to get over. Hell, their most memorable moment during the New Generation Era is probably the time they were tasked with opening the doors at the entrance ramp during the 1996 King of the Ring, and at one point in the show get bowled over by Ahmed Johnson like they were pins in a bowling alley. Still, while these might have been humble beginnings for the brothers, by the time the turn of the millennium came around, they'd have proven themselves to be stars. And this would allow them to remain in prominent roles with various companies over the years which followed, whether they were working as a tag team act or going it solo. So it should come as little surprise then that even today in 2025, they remain a team worthy of note, with them currently plying their craft in TNA. Of course, with TNA currently having a working relationship with WWE, however, it's meant Matt and Jeff have also been able to appear on WWE programming too. Yes, as recently as a couple of months ago, they were showing up in NXT to put their TNA tag team titles on the line against Fraxium. Does this mean we can expect to see them back on the main roster before long? It's certainly something we could see happening. And that would mean matches like the Hardys versus the Usos or the Hardys versus the Motor City Machine Guns, matches which are always crowd pleasers. Hell, like with Dustin Rhodes, we could easily see the brothers from North Carolina still going strong as far as whatever era comes after this present one. Sure, they may not be able to do everything they did back in the 90s, mainly because that style takes a massive physical toll on the body, but all they have to do at this point in order to get fans invested is play the hits anyway, and that's a testament to just how over they are. But let's move away from tag teams for now and back over to singles acts, another single act who up until very recently was working for TNA, and who first came to the attention of many fans during the New Generation era. That's right, it's time for us to talk about PCO. Yes, long before he was the French Frankenstein, Pierre-Carl Ouellet was one half of a tag team who went by the name of the Quebecers. Of course, the man who would later become known as PCO wouldn't remain a part of the Quebecers for all of the New Generation era, however. No, by 1995, he'd actually have gone solo as Jean-Pierre Lafitte, the one-eyed French-Canadian whose most notable feud was when he fought Bret Hart over a jacket. And when this run ended, he'd hang around in WWF for a little while longer, all up until the point he was cut from his contract in 1996. But that wouldn't be the end of the St. Catharines native's career. No, he'd continue on for decades yet after reinventing himself as an unstoppable force of nature named PCO, a French Frankenstein who quite simply could not be stopped no matter how much older he was getting. In fact, his run in TNA would continue on and off all the way up until 2024, at which point he shot on the promotion during the middle of a live pay-per-view, in the process destroying his digital media championship with a sledgehammer, all before leaving the Toronto-based company behind for good. Where has he gone since this? Well, despite now being 57, Ouellet doesn't appear to have any desire to stop yet, and that's why he can currently be found on Game Changer wrestling shows. Really, the only question at this point is, will we ever see him in a place like WWE or AEW before all is said and done? It's certainly a possibility, even if it's only for a one-shot. That said, given how old he's getting now, eventually the Canadian is going to have to think about slowing down and moving away from an in-ring role entirely. After all, this is something all wrestlers have to do eventually. It's certainly what happened with our next subject, Al Snow. Well, kind of. Yes, we'll add a caveat here, as well. In the present day, Al Snow is largely retired from a full-time schedule. He has stepped back inside the ring at least a few times in recent years. Of course, that's nothing compared to the schedule he was keeping during the New Generation era, though, when he was seemingly changing up his gimmick every week, throwing things at the wall on a constant basis in the hopes that, if he kept doing so, something would stick eventually. Seriously, between 1995 and 1997, Snow would work not just as Avatar, but also Shinobi and Leif Cassidy too. And when none of these gimmicks were enough to get him over in any substantial way, he'd spend the latter months of the New Generation era on an excursion to Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling, where he finally figured out a character who worked for him. Who was this character? Well, it was the head-loving maniac named Al Snow, something which connected with audiences way more than the budget Power Ranger or Ninja Assassin he'd been asked to play in the past. Hell, Al Snow would see Alan Sarvin become a star into the Attitude Era and beyond. And this meant that when in 2018 Ohio Valley Wrestling, a former developmental program for WWE, was going through financial troubles, he was able to buy it and take up the role of the company's head booker going forward. Yes, as it stands today, Al Snow is still the owner of OVW, and if you want an insight into what his job is like there, you can see this in the Netflix documentary, The Wrestlers. And it's even allowed him to step back into the ring again, as it was on October 27th of 2022 that he laced up his boots once more to team with Doug Basham as he took on Adam Revolver and Joe Mack in a tag team bout. Does this mean we can expect to see Al wrestle more and more as time goes on, just like he did during the mid-90s? Yes. In fact, he's already been doing this for the last 3 years now. That's right, after breaking the seal for that Ohio Valley Wrestling show and apparently catching the bug once more, Snow would continue to show up at various indie promotions around his local area, usually in tag team matches where he can take it a little bit easier on his body. So really then, the idea that he could ever appear in a WWE ring again before all is said and done isn't that crazy. And if not WWE, we could at very least see TNA booking a date with him if he were so inclined. And this might even see him end up standing on the opposite side of the ring from an old co-worker of his from ECW, someone who goes by the name of Shane Douglas. Of course, it's easy to forget now, though, that while his most famous run most certainly came when he was working in ECW with people like Taz, Raven, and Tommy Dreamer, Shane Douglas actually did serve a brief spell with WWF during the New Generation era, though it was not one which would be as critically acclaimed as some of his other efforts. Why was that? Well, because this was the period he was cast in the role of Dean Douglas, an evil teacher who perfectly fit in with the era of wrestling dentists and wrestling hockey players, amongst others. Needless to say then, this was not a run which lasted long. In fact, it would only be for a few months between July of 1995 and January of 1996 that the Pennsylvania native worked under Vince McMahon. That said, he was able to find some degree of success during this time, with him at one point very briefly becoming the Intercontinental Champion, all before leaving the company. Where would he go once his time in WWF came to an end? Back to ECW, and then from there on to places like TNA. Yes, for many years after his spell as Dean Douglas, Shane Douglas would continue to thrive. And while he may not be working at the same level he was back in the 90s, this has continued right up until the present day, as even now in 2025 he can be seen plying his craft at various indie shows around America, usually in tag team matches, but occasionally still in singles competition too. Sure, it's unlikely at the stage that he's at in his career now Shane is going to make a comeback to WWE, not unless it's for a one-night cameo appearance at an ECW-themed show. We just hope that if he does make another WWE appearance before all is said and done, Dean Douglas is nowhere to be found. No, that character can stay back in the New Generation era as far as we're concerned. And while we're at it, we'd also like to do the same with the New Generation era gimmick our next subject once had, another ECW alumni who might be best known as Too Cold Scorpio, but who also played a somewhat memorable role in mid-90s WWF as Flash Funk. That's right, while it's easy to forget now, the early run of Too Cold Scorpio in WWF during the mid-90s actually happened under a different name. So how did this all come about? Well, after a successful run in ECW between 1994 and 1996, which saw him feud with the likes of Taz, Sabu, and Shane Douglas, Charles Skaggs would be invited to go over to WWF and there try out his luck instead. That said, he wouldn't be keeping the same name once he arrived. No, Vince McMahon had something all new in mind for the Denver native at this point, the gimmick of a 70s-inspired character. And so was born Flash Funk, a man who could always be seen with his fur coat and hat, all while his Funkettes were very slowly dancing their way down to the ring by his side. Yes, in many ways he was Brodus Clay 1.0, the Funkasaurus's dad, if you will. Sadly though, none of this would be enough to see Funk find much success in New Generation era WWF. No, he'd always remain a mid-card act, with this being something which would continue during the Attitude Era, and he reverted back to his old name of Too Cold Scorpio. But while his WWF run may not have been a blow-away success, Scorpio remained a very good wrestler. So good, in fact, that even after he left WWF in 1999, he'd find plenty of work in other places like Pro Wrestling Noah. And even to this day, he can still be found wrestling on the indie circuit, despite the fact he's now 59 years old. Yes, age is apparently just a number for the former Flash Funk, because to see him at something like a Game Changer wrestling show today, you wouldn't think he was a man who was approaching the point of senior citizenship. Rather, you'd still see someone who was very athletic and could do a lot more than his years suggested. Really, at this rate, he could end up wrestling well into his 60s and even beyond if things work out right and he stays healthy enough. Hell, given how much ECW nostalgia there still is out there, there's always the possibility that WWE choose to bring him in for a one-shot at some point, perhaps on the same show as they might choose to bring in Shane Douglas as well. Like with Shane Douglas and his less popular incarnation, Dean Douglas, however, we do hope that if Too Cold Scorpio ever finds himself walking through the halls of WWF once more, the Flash Funk gimmick isn't given to him again, because that really is one which is best left in the New Generation era, right there alongside the early Rocky Maivia gimmick of our next subject, the man who would later go on to conquer the world, the man known to wrestling fans as The Rock. Now, we know the rise of The Rock happened during the Attitude Era. Hell, it was from 1998 onwards that he first really started breaking out as a top-level star, one who would at one point become the face of the entire company. But Dwayne Johnson's debut actually happened early enough for it to be considered part of the New Generation era, and this is because his first match with WWF happened at the November 17, 1996 Survivor Series, the period where Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, and Psycho Sid were all still in the main event scene fighting over the world title. As fans from this era will remember though, this debut did not go well for Maivia because, with his goody two-shoes smiling babyface character just not being what fans wanted anymore, he'd quickly be rejected to the point he was booed out of buildings everywhere he went. Obviously then, this all forced WWF to turn Rocky heel after a while, and that ended up being the best thing for him because it was here that he morphed into The Rock, a cocky villain who was more entertaining than anyone else around him, with his mic skills back in the 90s being second to none. And that would see him grow to such a level in fans' eyes he'd eventually become bigger than wrestling itself, with him eventually leaving the industry behind altogether to conquer Hollywood instead. That said, The Rock would return to wrestling as the years went on, and it's in wrestling where much of his focus remains today as it happens, because ever since 2024, he's been a member of the board of directors for TKO, WWE's parent company. Yes, as it stands today, Dwayne Johnson outranks Triple H, Shawn Michaels, and most everyone else in the WWE management system. And that means his current character of the final boss is very real, because it truly is the case that what he says goes, whether it's him inserting himself into the main event scene of WrestleMania 40 in order to try to stop Cody Rhodes from finishing his story, or him demanding Cody's soul 1 year later in the lead up to WrestleMania 41. Does this mean we can expect to see more of Dwayne Johnson on WWE TV in the future? Absolutely. In fact, there's a real possibility he's running the entire show before all is said and done. And if that happens, he'll have done what no one could ever have imagined back when they first saw Rocky Maivia walk through the curtain in 1996. But let's move away from the men for now and over to the women instead, as there is still at least one active woman who performed during the New Generation era. To tell her story though, we have to look out east, as she's none other than Aja Kong. Yes, Kong is one of the most decorated Japanese women's wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. However, most audiences would likely have first been introduced to her when she joined the WWF roster for a brief time in 1995. Why had Aja Kong joined the WWF in 1995? Well, because this was the point Vince McMahon was hoping to restart his women's division, with his plan being to build things around a Hulk Hogan-esque babyface in Alundra Blaze. Obviously then, any good babyface was going to need an army of heels to conquer, and so this was why Aja Kong was brought in as the primary heel for Blaze to go after. Sadly though, by the time January of 1996 had rolled around and the babyface side of the pairing had jumped ship to WCW with the belt in tow, there was no more need for her army of heel foils anymore. And this meant Kong's time in WWF would come to an end. Luckily then, this would be far from the end for the Tokyo native. No, while she wouldn't wrestle full-time in America again following this, she would have a very lengthy career still to go in her home country of Japan, with her primarily working there as a freelancer. And even if she wasn't full-time in the States anymore, she would still find the time to make the odd appearance here and there, with her native work still seeing her jump around from place to place as recently as May of 2025, and her US-based work seeing her make a couple of cameo appearances for AEW, first in 2019, and then again in 2021. Does this mean we can expect to see her show up again for AEW before all is said and done? It's certainly a possibility. And if it happens, Aja Kong won't be the only legend having one more match there, as the same thing will no doubt be happening soon enough with our next subject too, another alumni of the New Generation era of WWF. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Jeff Jarrett. That's right, Jeff Jarrett has remained an in-ring competitor for decades now. And back during the New Generation era, he was one of the very best mid-carders the WWF had to offer, with him even winning the Intercontinental title. Yes, he could always be counted on to have a great match no matter who he was in the ring with, so because he was such a trusted hand then, he'd continue to find work even after his time in WWF came to an abrupt and controversial end a few years later in 1999. That's right, despite it looking like he might be fully blackballed by this point, the Tennessee native continued to stay on top in places like WCW, TNA, and the short-lived Global Force Wrestling. Where has this left him as of 2025? Well, in the mid-2020s, Jeff is still a TV character, with him currently working as a player coach for All Elite Wrestling. In fact, as things stand right now, his story for the year involves him trying to win some AEW gold before his in-ring career comes to an end. So don't be surprised if he, Jay Lethal, and Satnam Singh all become trios champions before December arrives. And if that happens, it'll just be further evidence that Double J is immortal. But then the same could be said about everyone we've looked at today in some ways, because they all represent performers who have had lengthy careers long enough to stretch from the New Generation era all the way up until the present day.